I think I'm quite embarrassed, really, speaking when I've been invited by a French left organisation. You know, because in Britain we produced Harold Wilson, but you have the Paris Commune. So, you know, what can we say to you? You know, it's also, you know, there are different political affiliations, and obviously I'm international coordinator of the Green Party of England and Wales. You know, and relate to the French Greens. You know, I also really want to flag up socialist resistance. You know, the work they do for Ecosocialism is absolutely splendid. And, you know, the most militant and the most ideological, sophisticated eco-socialist political party in the world, of course, is their section in the Philippines, the Revolutionary Workers' Party, who do very impressive things. So, you know, what I would say is that there's maybe a rich ecosystem of different eco-socialist organisations, and I think that's how you do Leninism today, you know, that it's got to be plural and experimental and so on. So I'm very pleased to be here, but slightly embarrassed on both counts. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the threat from capitalism, alternatives to capitalism, practical politics. Very, very easy to forget all sorts of important things. So, you know, I was going to read something which I think is very, very important. And this is a quote from a woman who, in fact, the only woman to win a Nobel Prize for economics. I don't know if they've got a thing that women aren't allowed to do economics, but it was unusual for her to win it. And she said, "Our problem is how to craft rules at multiple levels that enable humans to adapt, learn and change over time, so that we're sustaining the very valuable natural resources that we inherited, so that we may be able to pass them on. I'm deeply indebted to the indigenous peoples in the USA who had an image of 7 generations being the appropriate time to think about the future. I think we should all reinstate in our mind the 7-generation rule. When we make really major decisions, we should ask not only what will it do for me today, but what will it do for my children, my children's children, and their children's children into the future." And that, of course, is from Elinor Ostrom. And I'm buried in the whole topic of Elinor Ostrom, who sadly died last year. I'm writing a 100,000-word tome for Routledge, which I'm hoping that people will swiftly pirate, because I wouldn't want it to be commodified entirely, but don't say that to Routledge on Taylor Francis. You know, I think she had this idea of you've got to have the really long term, and, you know, we can do things differently. And of course, with capitalism, you know, we don't think about the next 7 generations. On stock markets, we don't even think about the next 7 minutes. And what you have with the commodification of the world, the invasion of market values, the constant growth of capitalism, is a process which is poisonous to life on this planet. That what markets do is they disorganise, degrade, simplify and destroy the basic life support systems of this planet. And of course what we have is a world where people find it very, very difficult to think beyond the market. You know, that everything is reduced to market values. And this, you know, is the efficient cause of the crisis. This is what we have to reverse and overcome and so on. And it's one of the reasons why Ostrom was so important, because she came from an entirely liberal, non-left background, but actually said we can move beyond the market and the state. There's other forms of economic governance. And that, you know, in a sense, she reinvented communism, you know, and talked about the commons and how the commons work and collective property. So, you know, what I would say is that human prosperity, ecology, you know, efficient use of our resources are about economic democracy. You know, what Karl Marx described as communism. And that the very fact that the word has shock value shows what a bad state we're in, because what it's about is us controlling the world. That the world being for human beings and the rest of nature rather than the world being for the accumulation of commodities. So the reason why, I'm a Marxist, I have like a simple prejudice that I'm a human being, and you might think they're selfish, but I'm more concerned with human beings because I'm a human than I am with, the value of commodities and stock markets. But, what we have is we have a completely insane economic system, so anything which actually works and is appropriate, is seen as crazy extremism, or is even ruled out. And it's only just now that we're beginning to get the idea that you can have democratic ownership through the commons, which was Ostram's great contribution. And, we know that capitalism is so dangerous to the life support systems on this planet. We know that ecological systems, perhaps innately unstable, and they're innately resilient. We've got away from kind of old-style Victorian ecology where you have a series of different types of vegetation and they come to like a stable climax vegetation, and there you go, and it's very fragile and so on. Nature is quite robust, but for ecosystems to work, you need diversity so that where it's necessary for them to change, they can change and recuperate. And what we have with capitalism is the great simplification, that what you do is you take diverse natural environments, you cut down the forests, and you replace them with particular fast-growing crops and whatever, and you reduce the diversity. And it's, the big project of the market is to build in more and more instability. And if we look at the market in terms of economics, just in terms of the kind of straight economics of markets and commodities and so on, that you have George Soros, who's the kind of capitalist's capitalist, who made his billions from buying and selling currency. But what's interesting is Soros, who certainly isn't any kind of Marxist or socialist or ecologist, would say that when you marketise things, you get speculative bubbles. And when you get speculative bubbles, that builds more and more chaos into the system. So, London, we've commodified housing, we've got rid of council housing, the billionaires are sweeping in, and, the Evening Standard, which is just this, it's this sort of, it's almost like a manual for vivisectors. It's just the most disgusting thing if you ever see it, because it's always saying, like today it was saying, there's people sleeping on the streets. That's so shocking. How can we sweep them away? And it's celebrating, houses being sold for 200 million and so on and so forth. And the idea, that people have houses to live in, that's old school for the market. Their housing is commodified. And then, of course, we have housing bubbles, don't we? Because people buy houses when they think the value is going up. The value goes up in an artificial way and then crashes. Saw a bit of a stock market bubble, I think, yesterday. That crashed. And what markets need to do is keep on invading more of human life, commodifying it, and that builds in more and more speculation and more chaos. And then, if we look at the economy, it's growth or die, productivism, and making things with built-in obsolescence so you can resell them. John Bellamy Foster, the great American eco-socialist, said it's like the squirrel cage. I think they put squirrels where we put hamsters, but it's this kind of thing where you go round and round and faster, and this kind of madness. And of course we know with austerity that fits into the sort of basic Marx's basic account of over-accumulation, where you have to scrap capital and start again and so on. But also behind that, there's commodification. That what you're doing is you're taking assets which are publicly owned, you're privatising them, that creates commodity values, that puts more of the money in there. And it's so insane. I don't know whether Lenin did say this, but Lenin was purported, people who are more cool than Leninists than me may know this, but is purported to say that the capitalists would sell the rope they would use to be hanged with. And the capitalists know that we cannot take more and more coal out of the ground and more oil and more gas, yet you know, it's an orgy of doing that. You know, it's the kind of corporate welfare to subsidise it. You know, it's the suicide lobby who are, you know, coming up with climate denial. It's the very fact that we've had climate change, and that means that the ice disappears around the Arctic, which then means that people can go and explore oil. And while they're denying that that's even happening, they're actually going in and getting the oil. So it's an entirely suicidal system. It is a system which doesn't work. And that to merely say that is seen as a form of extremism. That, you know, that it's seen as unrealistic to be realistic. That it's much easier to envisage, you know, the end of the world, or the destruction of the human species, or the vast degradation of life, you know, compared to changing, you know, the property rights and property ownership that we have. So what I would say in terms of alternatives is one of the key moments of class struggle, and more than ever this is about class struggle. It's not even the sort of mediated class struggle of the 50s and 60s and the Keynesian settlement. You know, it's the, you know, vast accumulation by the billionaires. I'm never sure whether it's better to describe them as vampires or the obese. So you think of Gina Reinhardt, you know, the mining billionairess in Australia. And I always think, you know, we only need so many resources to get by. And if you're a billionaire, you're actually hugely obese. You know, and it's all these hugely obese people telling the rest of us to starve. So, you know, what we need to do is look at the fact that there is open class conflict, destroying possibilities for human beings and the rest of nature, that both our prosperity and the environment are being destroyed. And as I say, the key moment of class struggle is to look at property rights. And what we need to do is move towards democratic ownership of property. And of course what we see at the moment is property systems where you commodify, you marketise, and markets inevitably concentrate power and wealth. So one example of this, you look at the way that environmental problems are commodified through carbon trading. You know, I heard a presentation about fishing quotas, and fishing quotas are presented as something which is environmental, but you buy the fishing quotas, the people with the biggest boats do the fishing, and in the Shetlands, you know, the boat is so big that the community in the Shetlands who've been fishing for, so if any of you are vegans and you know, worried about me talking about killing fish, just ignore this. You know, but for thousands of years they've been fishing in the Shetlands, and there's now a boat which is so big it's got all of the kind of fishing quotas, and the Shetland community tried to buy the boat, that was stopped by the EU because it was seen as anti-trade, and then you know, RBS funded some corporation to come in and get the fish. You know, so all the time you've got this kind of changing of property rights to actually concentrate in the hands of the few. So to me, with the kind of communist socialist project, it's all eco-socialist project, it's always looking at how you democratise property, you create common ownership, you put things back into the hands of local communities. And again, you know, I could wax lyrically about Ostrom for about 3 weeks, but you know, what she did from a very liberal background is said there's not just private property and state property, there's collective property. Property is a bunch of rights, there's ways of managing property collectively, and to me, that's the kind of key eco-socialist message. And all the time, you know, austerity, you know, it might seem very far away, but all the time with austerity, it's actually concentrating property, simplifying, commodifying, going in the wrong direction. So what we need to do is to have a practical politics. And I think nobody, you know, on the left can actually say, my politics are right, your politics are wrong. I don't believe in politics as football teams, where you go, my team is fucking wonderful, and yours are all crap, yeah? And that generally happens with politics. What politics has to be about is thinking tactically and strategically to change property rights, to get practical gains, to move forward. And we're in the UK. You know, we haven't even had a successful fucking bourgeois revolution. You know, we are backward, there was probably more formal democracy in 1040 than there is now. You know, it's like the worst country, you know, it's not the worst, but it's, you know, shockingly undemocratic. You know, people, very little participation, you have political parties run by elites. I believe we still have like a monarch. I think they claim to be descended from the Norse kings and queens. You know, we've got unelected House of Lords. And again, the, you know, democracy has to be at the community level, and economic and so on. So, you know, inevitably, all of us on the British left are damaged and distorted and will inevitably come up with the wrong politics. You know, so we've got to work really, really hard. But what we must never do is moralise. You know, the circumstances are not good in Britain, but you have to get stuck in practically to see how you change the politics. And people will have very, very different strategies for doing this. But on the left, we've got to respect that different people do things in different ways and try and give the left in different organisations some solidarity. You know, sectarianism, the only people helped by sectarianism are the right. The idea of, you know, I've got an intellectual message which is right, what you're saying is wrong. How's that got anything to do with Marxism? You know, it's just, you know, like Gnosticism, it's not, you know. Anyway, I think there are some things which give hope. I think in Latin America we've seen vast progress, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Cuba, in terms of raising living standards. And again, you know, we can criticise growth, but, you know, if you look at things like open source, dealing with patents for pharmaceuticals, the idea of making goods to last longer, the idea of kind of communal councils, there's all sorts of ways that you can have real human prosperity. And that's something which I think is increasingly within the Latin American experience. As one of our other speakers said, the Alba bloc, those Latin American left countries, they've been the militant people in terms of climate change. Ecuador, very, very impressive with the Yasuni project, and they're actually saying, you know, we can't take the oil out of the ground, we've got to find economic development and funds to keep the oil in the ground, and that's basic, and that's an alternative to carbon trading, you know, which has been a gigantic fraud. Again, especially in Latin America, but right across the globe, the indigenous peoples are increasingly having agency. I'm very, very privileged to have worked with Hugo Blanco, who's the legendary indigenous leader in Peru, and Ecosocialists go online, and you can find Lucha Indigena, you know, and look at what's going on there. And, you know, we think of like Idle No More in Canada, but right across the Americas and across the world, indigenous people have been doing really impressive stuff. Got to be trade union action at the point of production and greening production. We know about 1 million climate jobs, and, you know, one of the things which we've got to talk about is green trade unionism. You may know about the experience in Australia in the 70s, where you had the green ban movement, where you had Jack Mundy and the Building Workers Union refusing to build anti-environmental buildings and buildings in conservation zones and so on. And there's the idea of, you know, like the Lucas Plan, nothing to do with Caroline, bless her, you know, where you had an aerospace company in the 80s in Britain, and they came up with alternative production. You know, so we can make things differently. And it's, I think, particularly difficult in England. I think it's difficult in Europe as a whole, but certainly what we've seen in places like Greece and with your own work in France, that it's possible to build alternatives. But what I would say, you know, is we're not in an era of post-Marxism. I mean, Foucault, we all love Foucault. Foucault was great, but we're not in an entirely post-Marxist, you know, we haven't got rid of sort of, you know, that grand narrative that there's still capitalism and that we have to overcome capitalism so that we can make history. And what we know from reading John Bellamy Foster is that Marx and Engels were great ecologists. We proudly have the label Ecosocialism because not all of the you know, Marxists in the last century, bless them, Trotsky, you know, they were not always perfectly attuned to permaculture and ecology, but Marx and Engels were splendid ecologists. They knew about the idea of the commons and common property. They knew about the principle of usufruct, which is the idea that you can use resources as long as you leave them in a good state for the future. You know, they talked about water pollution on the Rhine, the condition of the English working class. Won't mention that Engels was a factory owner. I had a trip to Manchester, don't mention that at all. But the condition of the English working class, you know, he talked about in the 1840s, the environmental damage that affected workers. And, you know, we must always inscribe on our banners, you know, Marx and Engels, or maybe it would scare people off, I don't know. You've got to be careful with the beards, haven't you? But great quote from Marx to finish off with: even in entire society, a nation, or all simultaneous existing societies taken together, are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations as good heads of household. So it's about how we practically put that into action, and there is no alternative. You know, we have to have a change in the basic mode of production, or this mode of production will crush us.
So, pardon me, I'm going to need all these sheets of paper, and I'm not sure that my accent is going to be as good as for the previous ones. But, first of all, dear friends and comrades, thank you very much for inviting me tonight. Thank you to all from Gauche members who have been organizing this event. And of course, thanks to our guests and speakers, Louise and Derek and Romain, thank you very much. I'm really hit tonight by the fact, as Romain said, that it really feels good to hear the same words and references in another language. Feel more numerous by this time. And it's especially the case because I really mean it all the more that here in London, so you are at the front line, because alas, we know that England showed us the way. And in 1979 already, the Clash castigated Margaret Thatcher's Ice Age, rejected symbols from the past, the nuclear era with the accident at 3 Mile Island the year before, and also calling upon the youth to wake up with these words: come out of the cupboard, all you boys and girls. Yeah. And, well, today all Europe has become a real austerity lab where the people's sovereignty was hijacked and public life became depoliticized. All the more so in Greece, of course, where the Greek government looks to fill its coffers by selling everything they can, brutally closing down public TV and radio channels, but also leaving Qatari funds to massively invest in its gold mines and in its banks, opening up its ports capital to Chinese investors, selling out even its islands, 6 of which have just been sold to the Emir of Qatar for a few million euros. At home, in France, unemployment has been repeatedly breaking its records for more than